I'm going to dissect the rule I want to talk about who it applies to, when it applies, what the exemptions are, what the requirements are, and how survey requirements as well. It's a big part of the rule. So we're going to go through the rule section by section. So
Just a
what?
quick
First
note.
of all,
Hey, sorry, Matt, just a real quick question. I just wanted to let everybody know that the recording has started.
and as a reminder, I'm only going to be discussing the requirements for asbestos removal and demolition that apply to the air pollution control district. And please be reminded that there are other agencies out there that do have overlapping requirements with asbestos, and please refer to them for their requirements. I'm not going to get into the other potential requirements, just the APCD requirements today. So what is asbestos? It's a natural occurring mineral. Has very small microscopic fibers that are able to pierce the small lining of the lungs. It has incredible properties that have made it very enticing for building materials over the last century. It was considered a miracle product and used in almost every type of building material. Uh, and also other strange areas like baby powder, cigarette filters, even in the snow in the Wizard of Oz. It's also the state rock serpentine of California. It has incredible properties, resistance to heat, electricity, corrosion. That's why, for all these properties, that's why you find it in so many different materials today. The asbestos that we care about most here with Rule 1206 is anything that is greater than 1%. If it's more than 1%, or if a material is greater than 1% asbestos, it's regulated, or potentially regulated for Rule 1206. Why do we care? Because asbestos is harmful. When it is disturbed, the fibers can become airborne and inhaled and cause asbestos-related deaths, such as mesothelioma, cancer, asbestosis. Every year in the United States, there are thousands of people that continue to die from asbestos-related deaths. For Congress, there is no known safe exposure limit to asbestos for the EPA and Congress. So there's no minimum safe exposure limit to asbestos. The EPA has determined in the past and presently that there is no expiration date for the requirements of asbestos as far as when a building has been constructed. So the Rule 1206, applies both to old buildings and new buildings. This is a common misconception that comes up all the time. I have a new building, there's no asbestos. The rule doesn't apply to me. The rule does apply to buildings of all ages. Asbestos was very common, like I mentioned. It was more common in buildings up until the 1980s, but it can still be found in newer buildings, just not as commonly. In a typical house, these are the most common areas where you can find asbestos: insulation, roofing, popcorn ceiling, ceiling tiles, flooring, wall, exterior, stucco. There's all kinds of different areas. It also piping as well. Asbestos, the reason why it can still be found in new materials is because it wasn't entirely banned in new products up until recently. And also it is imported, or can be, or has been imported illegally through Canada and Mexico and other materials. Here are some of the materials where it wasn't banned until recently. Roofing materials, like even Home Depot was selling asbestos in one of its roofing cements up until recently. Rule 1206, when does it apply? Like when it applies anytime you are doing a renovation or demolition. So a renovation and a demolition have different meanings when it comes to Rule 1206. For Rule 1206, it just means anytime you are disturbing any suspect building materials. And a demolition is when you are wrecking any load bearing structure. You are basically destroying a load bearing structure. So anytime any one of these two types of activities occur, you have to ask yourself, does Rule 1206, the asbestos removal, renovation, and demolition rule, apply to my project? And these are the facilities that are considered regulated per the rule. There are some facilities that are exempt. I'll get into those, but these are the ones that are regulated. Essentially, it's any kind of institutional, commercial, public, or industrial, and in some cases, residential. I'll talk about that a little later. The non-residential ones that are always going to be regulated are hospitals, military, shopping malls, post office, different types of facilities here that are pretty obvious. One that may not be so obvious is a billboard. It's a commercial billboard that would be subject to Rule 1206. Here are some more examples: bridges, tunnels, even a farm, because that is commercial, a water tower. So anytime you ever have any doubt, if you're not sure if the structure you're working on is subject to the rule, always call and ask. We're happy to tell you if it's regulated or not. Some of the residential that is regulated would be a condo complex when there are more than 4 dwelling units. If it's a condo complex with less than 4 dwelling units, it would be exempt of Rule 1206. So the distinction here, the important distinction, is more than 4 dwelling units. Another one that a lot of people don't understand is regulated is modular type structures. Like here in these photos, these are typically used for classrooms, portable classrooms that are at schools or at our offices at construction sites. When they are with no foundation and just lying, I mean, with no wheels, not immediately ready for road travel, that is. If they have a foundation, skirting, or if they're on the ground, like in these pictures here, anytime that they are lifted up off the ground or a renovation occurs on them, they would be subject to Rule 1206 because they're commercial or institutional. So let me talk about some of the more exemptions when it comes to residential. So this is probably the most tricky one that a lot of people have difficulty with. Residential structures, as I said, when a condo complex has more than 4 dwelling units, it's regulated. Less than four, it's exempt. So single family homes by themselves are exempt. But there is one exception to that, and this is an EPA determination that we have to enforce as well. When you have multiple residential structures at the same location and they are detached, like in this photo, we have two houses, but they're in the same property, contiguous property, and have the same owner, or under the same owner, they would be regulated. So any kind of renovation or demolition that occurs at a property or structure like this would be regulated. It's called an installation. If you look under the definition of installation, bottom right there, that comes from Rule 1206. That is considered regulated per the rule. And this would also apply, like when I said common owner or operator, an example of an operator would be an HOA or property manager. So if they do, or if they're overseeing a renovation or demolition project at a facility like this, that would make it regulated. Anybody have any questions on that before I move on? Okay. Just to expand on that just a little more, here's a photo of two duplexes or multiple duplexes. There's two residential structures in each building. Now, if let's say each one of these residential units is individually owned, if the work was only, if there was a renovation project that was happening inside one of the units by the owners, that would be exempt. But if, let's say, an HOA who oversees all of these structures is doing work on the roof, for example, that would make it an installation and that would be regulated per Rule 1206. Any questions on that? Feel free to reach out to me afterwards or call me anytime, and I'm happy to talk more about this. Okay, so the exemption of Rule 1206 also applies to the quantity. Okay, so the amount of suspect building materials disturbed over a rolling 365-day period before that project is subject to the rule should be 100 square feet or more. Okay, so if you're doing a renovation project and you're disturbing more than 100 square feet of building materials, you have to, at a minimum, do a survey to determine the presence of asbestos, absence or presence of asbestos before, and that's key, before you start the renovation or demolition. That will disturb the materials. Survey is required, as I mentioned, to determine the presence of asbestos. It applies both to old and new buildings and must be conducted by individuals that are certified at a minimum with EPA approved building inspector course. We also accept, because they are more thorough and more stringent, the CAC and SST, Certified Asbestos Consultant and Site Surveillance Technician certifications. So any one of these certifications are allowed. But if a survey is done by an individual who does not have these certifications, we will not accept it. I want to talk about, let's the survey is done, okay, and what happens next? If the survey indicates that there's no asbestos, then Rule 1206 does not apply to the remainder of your renovation. If you're doing a demolition and you're wrecking a load-bearing structure, it doesn't matter if your survey indicates there's any asbestos. You still have to submit a notification for a demolition. Okay, because the reason why is a lot of times the survey is not able to get to all of the materials that weren't available or that might be concealed beneath or behind load-bearing structures. So the inspector needs to come out, do an inspection of the demolition to ensure that there are no hidden materials that don't go unnoticed during the demolition. And if they are detected by the demolition company, they should stop and immediately survey those materials and make sure that they do not contain asbestos. So for the notification requirements for asbestos removal, if the survey comes back and indicates that there's more than 100 square feet or 100 square feet of or more of regulated asbestos that will be disturbed, a notification is required, and those materials must be removed before any activities that will disturb them potentially. A certified company must be hired to do the removal, and there are removal requirements. I'll talk more about those later, and also disposal requirements as well. Those materials must be taken to a certified landfill. Suspect materials are required to be analyzed for asbestos prior to renovation and demolition. I'm going to talk about what those suspect materials are. They are defined in the rule. If any one of these materials will be disturbed by your project, they absolutely must be surveyed for asbestos. And this is a list of them, friable, and by friable, they crumble easily with hand pressure. So acoustic sealing is the most common one that we see. And paper backing on vinyl sheet flooring, insulation materials, ceiling tiles. A lot of times, ceiling tiles, they themselves may not be asbestos containing, but the fireproofing above them that degrades over time and falls on top of them would render that ceiling tile regulated. These are different materials right here that always require a survey and are the most common for containing asbestos. Then there are other types of non-friable asbestos containing materials that also require a survey and may become regulated depending on how they are planning to be removed or if they are in poor condition. Um, Category 1 materials are floor tiles, roofing, packings, gaskets. So they typically are not regulated if removed with hand methods and they are in good condition. If they are in poor condition, if they're already starting to degrade and fall apart, then they might be regulated. And definitely, if the removal is done by mechanical methods, sanding, which would subject them to sanding, grinding, cutting, or abrading, then that could also make these materials regulated and subject to Rule 1206. Here are some pictures of these non-friable Category 1 materials. Um, each layer has to be surveyed individually for asbestos. A lot of times we've seen with flooring materials and with roofing materials, you can have multiple layers and maybe only the top layer is actually surveyed for asbestos. And when the renovation occurs, all layers including the top and those below it are actually disturbed, but maybe the very bottom one, which has been ignored over the last few decades, and with new materials put on top of it, if that is disturbed and it contains asbestos, then you could have a potential violation for Rule 1206. So make sure to always survey each layer separately and don't ignore the bottom layers because those are the layers that typically contain asbestos. In the past, it's always easier by a lot of building owners to, instead of removing, because it is more costly to remove the asbestos, it was just cheaper to put a non-asbestos layer of flooring above an asbestos containing one and hope that, they don't have to deal with it for many years to come. Category 2, this is another non-friable kind of asbestos. It typically is cementitious, concrete-like products. It could be piping, stucco, plaster. It also applies, it's not cementitious, but mastic, floor mastics, and adhesives. So any cementitious asbestos product always has to be removed before a demolition because a demolition is likely going to render it regulated. These materials are considered Category 2 because they can be easily crumbled, pulverized, or reduced to powder when there is a demolition or mechanical methods that are used. So here are some photos of them. Um, Now you're gonna see like these materials. We hand methods like you even have to be like with stucco. You have to be careful even with hand methods. Like people often ask, "Can I use a hammer to remove the stucco?" Because it's a hand method. Well, my response is, well, a hammer, although it's a hand method, is still going to pulverize that material and render it friable. The key distinction here is typically hand removal methods will not make a material regulated, but not every single case, so just common sense needs to be applied. But it is typically mechanical methods that will render that material friable versus hand methods. Category, another one, this is one, paint, asphalt, and concrete. those are materials that don't typically contain asbestos and they're not actually listed in the definition of Rule 1206 as a suspect material, meaning like you have a choice. You can take the gamble of not surveying them before your renovation. However, we always recommend you talk to your EPA building inspector or whoever it is, whoever your trained individual is that's doing your survey, and find out if they think it's in their good idea to do the survey of these materials, just in case, because they can still contain asbestos, although not as common. Typically, it's more common in military type structures or structures where there's a high potential for corrosion, like down marine structures, for example. And then sometimes in asphalt parking lots, even it can happen, like more maybe in a runway at an airport because of the friction of airplanes landing and stuff. So it just depends on the type of material. Typically, concrete, asphalt, paint, not containing asbestos, but not always. Here are some more non-friable suspect materials, mastics. This is a common one when there's a floor buffer, and you could have asbestos in the mastic, and the floor buffer is definitely going to grind that up and make it become airborne, releasing fibers into the air, making it dangerous. And some other pictures here. Adhesives sometimes can contain asbestos. Additional survey requirements. Survey is only required in the areas of the building that will be disturbed. So we're not going to require a survey for other areas that are not going to be part of the renovation or demolition. The survey has no expiration date. It's good for the life of the building, providing there aren't any new materials that are added to the building, or if there are renovations and there are materials that weren't surveyed, like maybe they have been removed over the years, and there are other materials that were behind the walls or the floors that weren't surveyed. It's always your responsibility to make sure you update the survey accordingly before you do a renovation or a demolition. Survey must be kept on site and shown to the inspector when they come to do an inspection of your renovation or demolition. You can either show it via hard copy or electronic version. There's one exception to when a survey does not need to, when you don't need to do a survey. Rule 1206 states that if you already know, I mean, if you want to presume that a material, let's say the popcorn ceiling, if you want to presume that it contains asbestos, you could do that without having to burden the extra cost of surveying it. But you have to check this box here on this notification, and this would only apply during a regulated removal of asbestos, meaning you're already notifying us, you already hired a certified company to come out and remove it and dispose of it as regulated per Rule 1206. So in this situation, you can go ahead and presume it and not have to survey it. In all other situations, it has to be surveyed. So I'm going to walk you through the survey requirements and what a survey looks like. Um, all of this is in Section D of Rule 1206. First, we need information on the building where the survey was conducted. We need to know the date. We need to know the address. We need to know who did the survey so we can verify that they were certified. Their name, certification date, number, type of certification, and expiration. So if whoever did the survey, if their expiration was, or if their certification was expired during the survey, we would not accept that survey. So always verify that their certification is valid at the time that the survey was conducted. This is a typical what it looks like as far as the materials, where they're located, the percentage that age of asbestos of that material that was surveyed. Like for example, in the kitchen, sheet vinyl, 15% chrysotile. That's what a typical survey looks like. Inspectors will ask for this, and they use this to guide them through the inspection. If one of these is not available on site, they'll automatically write a violation to the owner and contractors involved. And before any additional renovation or demolition work can resume, a survey must be conducted in order to avoid any additional violations. So, in addition to the certification of the individual conducting the survey, the laboratory that does the analysis of the suspect materials has to be certified as well. The laboratory has to be NAVLAB accredited, National Voluntary Laboratory Accreditation Program, and it has to be accredited at the time of the survey. And this is what that certification looks like. And this also has to be included in your survey in order for us to accept that survey. You need to know the name and address of the lab and the types of methods that were used to analyze the asbestos. They have to be EPA approved. The most common EPA approved is polarized light microscopy. And there is also the second most common is the point count, PLM point count, which is more thorough and a little more costly. And we will always hold the point count over the PLM because it is more thorough. And if you have asbestos that comes back with a survey at less than 1%, we will always recommend that you do a point count just to ensure that it isn't going to be more than 1%. Or um, if we take a sample and it's less than 10%, we always do a point count just to ensure that the final asbestos content is over 1%. Remember, 1% is regulated. That, according to the definition of asbestos in Rule 1206, 1% is regulated. As far as the surveying guidelines go, there is there is no requirement in Rule 1206 that says how many samples have to be taken. Each individual homogeneous type of suspect material must be surveyed at least once. Um, we will always recommend that AHERA sampling guidelines be followed to ensure that no asbestos is overlooked, because the worst case scenario here is that you do a renovation or a demolition and it disturbs asbestos. The goal here is to make sure that you identify it so that you can remove it so that it is not disturbed. Because once it's disturbed, that's when you're going to be in violation. So, AHERA guidelines for any suspect homogeneous type of material. If there's 1,000 square feet of it, we recommend 3 samples taken. If it's 1,000 to 5,000 square feet, 5 samples. If it's more than 5,000, 7 samples. So, um, again, representative sampling is always going to be recommended. Questions on that? Okay. As I mentioned, there's no there a survey is required, and there are no alternatives that are accepted by us other than presuming and notifying and removing that material as regulated per Rule 1206. Common misconception is that we would take a letter from the architect stating that the building is asbestos free, or some kind of an SDS for that material stating that it is asbestos free, or even having a contractor send us an email saying the building is new and there's no asbestos. None of these will be accepted by us. The only allowable method is a survey with a laboratory analysis to determine the presence or absence of asbestos. Now, when an inspector comes out for a inspection, if they see a renovation or demolition in their areas, a lot of times they'll stop and verify that all Rule 1206 requirements are being met. Other times they stop by is when we get a complaint, or if it's a notified project, if a notification has been submitted to us, they will go out and inspect the renovation or demolition per that notification. But the first thing they always do is ask for a copy of the survey. And If there has been asbestos identified in the survey, they want to know, has it been removed before the renovation or demolition? And a lot of times it may have already been removed. Maybe it was non-friable, never regulated, didn't require a notification in the past. So, to show the inspector that that material has been removed, if it has, you can demonstrate the removal by giving them some kind of a receipt, work order, any kind of documentation to show that the non-regulated asbestos materials have been removed in the past. Because the reason why we care now is that that demolition or renovation that they're there to inspect may actually render that non-friable asbestos regulated. So important to be able to show the inspector that it's been removed, and that will shorten their inspection and get them out of your hair sooner. Or if it was friable, if it was popcorn ceiling or something that's been removed in the past, and they'll try to look up the history as well to see if there's been notifications submitted to us in the past. But it helps if you could provide that information to them as well. So let me talk about the notification requirements. So if your project you're subject to the rule, it's a regulated facility, and more than 100 square feet of asbestos is being removed, and it is determined to be regulated, you have to notify us, and that's for a removal or a demolition if it's a load-bearing structure that's being wrecked. Um, Here are the requirements for the notification. The notification must be submitted 10 working days prior to the start date. The notification has to be complete and accurate. We have an online notification system that helps you to submit the form. And anytime you have any questions or you stumble through the process, you can always call us, call the compliance division, and our aides will assist you and help walk you through the process. The notification has to be, the fees for it have to be submitted within 1 working day after the submittal. And there's all kinds of other information that is required to be in the notification that the inspector will review before they go out to do an inspection. And that notification is valid for 1 year, 365 days. For types of notifications, a planned renovation. This applies to large facilities like apartment complexes, hospitals, and it covers all the little tiny mishaps that may result in small repairs and maintenance that could potentially disturb asbestos. And this has to be submitted a year before you plan for it to go into effect. And it's a substitute for submitting all kinds of individual emergency renovation notifications for every type of emergency situation that would require asbestos to be disturbed during a repair, like little burst pipes, flooding type events, a little electric type emergencies that occur in large facilities that are just kind of routine. A notification is required to be revised when the amount of the regulated material is exceeded by whatever 20% or more from whatever you notified, from the amount you notified initially, or if you change the start date. This is the most common violation we issue. Inspector goes out on the start date on the notification, and there's no work done. Um, no work by that, I mean, like no asbestos has been removed, or no, the demolition is not started yet. If that's the case, they will issue a violation, and it's the most common one we issue, and it's the easiest to avoid. So always just reach out to us and let us know if you can't start the start date before midnight, and leave us a voicemail or email us. Just let us know. And just something about cancellations. You can cancel a notification, but again, you have to do it before the start date. And start date is when you start the active removal of asbestos. Or for a demolition, it's when you actually start erecting a load-bearing structure. And In the case of a modular structure, like in the picture in the bottom left, it's when you lift it up off of its foundation. That is the actual start date of a demolition. And I talked a little bit about this already for modular structures. Ones that are immediately ready for road travel, if they're on wheels and they can just drive off of a facility, they are not subject to Rule 1206. But if they're just sitting on the ground without wheels, or if they have a foundation, the moment they're lifted off that foundation, subject to Rule 1206, that's considered a demolition. And any suspect materials that could be disturbed by lifting it up off the foundation must be surveyed for asbestos before doing this. These are activities that are not considered demolitions. Anytime you remove furniture or cabinet from a facility, or if you are altering or resupporting a load-bearing structure, replacement of a if basically you're reinforcing it and doing work on it to ensure that the load bearing structure can continue to be used, or if you're just laying pipe or electrical wiring, this is not considered a demolition. The intent is a demolition is when you are doing work with the intent to wreck or remove that load bearing structure. Some flow charts here to help you to walk you through the requirements of the Rule 1206 for removal, asbestos removal and renovation. So please refer to this in the future. I'm not going to go through it. Basically, it just summarizes everything I've already talked about, but this will help you walk through the requirements for a asbestos removal or renovation. And this is a separate flow chart that'll walk you through the requirements for a demolition. Hopefully this is of some assistance to you. And I want to talk to you about when asbestos can remain in a structure. This is in the rule, and it also comes from the federal standards. But in most cases, asbestos should always be removed from a facility before a demolition or renovation in the area where it is located, because of the strong possibility that it will become disturbed and regulated. And once that occurs, once the fibers are released and that structure is contaminated, gets into the ventilation, it starts to travel into other parts of the building. It is very expensive to decontaminate. And if there are violations, the penalties can be very expensive. And of course, the litigation from the lawsuits and everything, it is just much easier to take a gamble on the side of caution and remove the asbestos before a demolition or renovation to ensure that it is not disturbed and becomes regulated, even if it is not friable. Poor condition, uh, we talked about, when non-friable materials are in poor condition, they could also be regulated by the rule. And this is a definition that comes out of Rule 1206 for poor condition. It just means that if it's already starting to fall apart and crumble, it could be because of a lot of times this is in old buildings, the exterior that's exposed to rain, sun, uh, a marine environment. Many years of exposure can render that building material in poor condition, which basically means it can become easily crumbled, or asbestos fibers can be easily released while and disturbed during the renovation or demolition. More cementitious materials that should be removed before demolition: roofing shingles. These are mechanical methods that can easily render non-friable materials regulated. Some examples, but not all inclusive: jackhammers, bead blasters, floor buffers, bulldozers. If we see something like this being used on a building and there's a puff of dust, first thing we want to know is what is it disturbing? And if we'll ask for a survey. If one is not conducted, we'll write a violation most likely. And if the survey indicates that that material is asbestos containing, then that is a big problem and most likely going to result in a violation of Rule 1206. Removal requirements. So if a notification is submitted, the inspector shows up at the job site of the renovation or demolition. If there's asbestos being removed, the inspector is going to ask if someone on site for the asbestos abatement company has the AHERA certification, the asbestos contractor supervisor core certification. Somebody actively involved in the removal and on site has to have that certification. Inspector will review it, make sure it's valid. A lot of times there will be containment set up to isolate the asbestos during its removal to ensure that no visible emissions travel to the outside of the work area and that they stay wet. Water has to be used to keep them wet because water helps to suppress the asbestos fibers from being released into the air. If there is a containment area, there'll be a little viewport that the inspectors can look through to look into the job site to see if all of Rule 1206 requirements are being followed. Essentially, water being used and that the materials reflect what was notified. This is an example of when there might not be a window viewport because when there's only one entrance, like because it's through a doorway where the workers have to decontaminate, then there's not going to be a window. But in every other situation, there has to be a window through containment for the inspector to look into. Removal requirements, the materials have to be kept wet during the removal. Or water has to be used during the removal. The materials have to be adequately wet, and then they have to stay adequately wet until they're bagged in leak tight wrapping. The inspector has to be able to visually look inside the wrapping to see moisture to ensure that the material is kept wet. And if these materials are removed from the top of a building, they can't just be thrown off the top and into a dumpster. They have to be carefully lowered to prevent any kind of dust. And if it's greater than 50 feet, they have to be lowered through a clear wrapping, like in the photo on the right. You have a chute that's enclosed and it's lowered into a dumpster that is enclosed to prevent any kind of visible emissions of dust that could be asbestos containing. So when talking about non-friable pipe, like transite pipe, the areas of this that, as far as the rule applicability is concerned, it is 100 square feet, and it only applies to the areas of the pipe that are disturbed. So not if the pipe part of the pipe is not being disturbed, you don't include that in your measurements. Usually it's just the ends and areas that are either in poor condition or being disturbed via mechanical methods like a bulldozer, for example. And you would measure up the square footage, so you may have to convert the area of the pipe that is disturbed from linear feet to square footage to determine if there's more than 100 square feet. This is the formula that it's an example. I'm not going to go through it, but you're welcome to reference it if you need assistance in how to make these measurements. What we look for in an inspection is, are there any visible emissions? This is the key thing inspectors look for. Um, is there any debris of asbestos containing materials that was not properly contained, wetted, and cleaned up? Bagged. So when an inspector is walking through a work site, they're looking for little specks of debris like this. And if they find it, they'll sample it. And if it comes back positive for asbestos, violations will be issued. So even if there is debris, we always recommend good housekeeping because a lot of times even if it's not asbestos containing, especially in apartment complexes or condo complexes or in areas where the public are located, if they see something that looks like there might be, there may be concerns and they may suspect that there's asbestos been removed, they see asbestos warning signs and they see specks of, even if it's new drywall and it's not asbestos containing, or if it's a material that is not suspect, if they see it on the ground outside of the entrance to containment, the public will automatically assume that it could be asbestos, and they call in complaints to us, and that's when we go out and investigate. And even if that material doesn't come back positive, our investigation may find other violations as well. The asbestos materials must be kept in secured and locked containers to prevent public accessing. Like, this is after the removal. You want to make sure you have asbestos warning labels on either the bags or on the containers where the waste is located, and has to be locked. It can't be accessible to the public, especially if it's out in an alleyway or out in in the parking lot of whatever the facility is where the removal is occurring. Again, these bags have to be clear so the inspector can view inside and verify if there is water moisture. This is an example of an asbestos warning label that has to be on the bags or in the container. And regulated waste has to be taken to a certified landfill. There are none in San Diego County. What we typically see is Azusa and La Paz, Arizona. So those are the ones that are most commonly used for disposal of materials that are removed here in San Diego. We will verify that materials are taken to certified landfills. We'll ask inspectors, sometimes we'll ask for a waste manifest, which you have 5 days to provide. And once the material is removed from a location, you have 45 days to take it to a certified landfill. And for whatever reason, sometimes there are intermediate storage waste facilities. For whatever reason, it takes longer. You just have to give us notification. You have to document it and share that with the APCD. Last thing is test methods. This is the last section of Rule 1206. So this goes back to the survey requirements and the laboratory analysis for the building materials to determine if they contain asbestos. These are the requirements for the laboratory analysis. Again, the laboratory has to be NAVLAB accredited, and the method has to be EPA approved. Each suspect material has to be analyzed separately. Every layer has to be analyzed separately. Remember, I said the flooring there's multiple layers of flooring or roofing. Each layer has to be analyzed separately and calculated separately and if it's more than 1% asbestos, then it could be regulated. You can't composite those different layers, because you composited them and your composite came back less than 1%, then it wouldn't be regulated. There's only one exception to when you can composite, and that's when you have drywall where there's nail holes, cracks, and you use joint compound to cover those imperfections in the wall. A lot of times the joint compound may contain asbestos in itself, more than 1%. But once you add it to the wall system, you're allowed to composite the drywall and the joint compound, which more often than not is going to have a composite analysis of less than 1%. It's not going to be regulated. You can't just add the joint compound as a texture layer. If you do that, you can't composite it. It has to be analyzed separately if it's a texture layer. This is all in Rule 1206 it comes out of the test methods section. Again, this is a little complicated, so if you have any questions on it, feel free to reach out to me. I can explain it in more detail with you on the phone or in person. This is a photo of what it looks like with joint compound, and it's used to cover imperfections. You just see it kind of crisscrossed in a room across the wall system. So one thing I do want to I want to make sure everybody understands is that we also have Rule 51, the public nuisance rule. So let's say Rule 1206 does not apply. Maybe you are doing a renovation or a demolition of a single family home. Remember, that is exempt of Rule 1206, providing it's not an installation, right? Um, if it's a single family home, it's exempt. Now, Rule 51, the nuisance rule, could potentially apply to the asbestos removal if you're removing asbestos, and let's say there are asbestos clouds coming from your house, and those clouds are crossing property lines into your neighbor's yard or into a school across the street, you could have a potential violation of the nuisance rule, because remember what I said, that there's no known safe exposure limit to asbestos, so the nuisance rule could definitely apply. So we always recommend, even if you're exempt of Rule 1206, to ensure that asbestos is removed properly to avoid any kind of public exposure. Um, Another other types of nuisances involving asbestos is when, again, we get complaints, we come out and investigate. Most of our violations occur as a result of complaints, public complaints that are received by us with illegal asbestos, and could be condo units where the owner hires a day laborer who's not trained, and popcorn ceiling is a typical culprit. We'll come out and we'll see a trail of debris from the alleged unit all the way to a dumpster of popcorn ceiling debris. We'll sample that, comes back positive, we'll issue violations. And if it's in a public area, we may also issue a violation for public nuisance, which is a much higher fine. So between, in this case, this was a bank and there was fireproofing 20, 30%, something asbestos. In a public area by the bus stop, I saw people tracking it on their shoes into the bus. It was entire treads. People saw a mother pushing her baby stroller through it. This was a pretty hefty fine of public nuisance. And this is just our fines. Again, the cleanup was far more expensive. To decontaminate the building and the public areas. And then there are other agencies as well that get involved. Environmental health got involved. They issued their own fines. Probably Cal OSHA also gets involved. A lot of times we share information with our violations with Cal OSHA, and they may also investigate to determine if there are any violations of their requirements. So there are multiple agencies that can get involved in our violations and may also issue fines. And then in the end, there's the litigation too, which could come many years later, which could be very potentially expensive. So all things to consider when, you make the determination, should I just remove the asbestos to begin with and before the renovation or demolition and do it per Rule 1206? You know, always, my recommendation, of course, is always going to be follow the rule, avoid the headache of the other option. Um, we have a list server of any new updates regarding the asbestos rule. You can follow this link and join the email list server. This is a link to the online notification system. And then here is a link to more information for our asbestos information page. Any questions? Well, with that, I will, we are done. Thank you for attending and have a nice day. And if you have any questions, you can email me later on, Matthew Allison. And I think that's the next slide right here. Yep. You can email me, Matthew Allison. That's my email and phone number right there. Or if I'm not here, you can always reach out to the compliance division. Thank you very much.